One of the most intriguing Greek mythological tales is that of the Trojan War. Steeped in legend and inscribed onto epic poetry, the conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans is explored in Creative Assembly's second installment of their SAGA series. A Total War Saga Troy covers the earliest time period ever in the series and a first for its new Bulgarian subsidiary studio. With the game receiving a massive anniversary update and DLC for its September 2021 Steam release, we examined the past year of development and analysed the game's current state in a comprehensive analytical review. This is a Total War Saga Troy Year in Review. In 2017, Creative Assembly, Total War's British-based developers, acquired Bulgarian-based Black Sea Studios as a subsidiary branch, renamed as Creative Assembly Sofia. This smaller studio produced the last two DLCs for Total War Rome 2, before being entrusted with the reins on developing their own title in the Saga series. Total War Sagas were designed to explore a limited scope and time frame, emphasizing a particularly engrossing narrative or pivotal historical event. The first in this series was Thrones of Britannia, examining a brief period of the British Isles immediately after Alfred the Great's victory over the Viking Danes. This game had mixed reception and cast doubt on the potential of the Saga sub-series, with main criticism at its uninteresting premise. Conversely, nobody can discount the allure of the Trojan War, one of the most important events in Greek mythology. Creative Assembly Sofia given license to lead the development for what is their debut title in the Total War series, albeit one on a smaller scale. It can be seen as an opening trial of sorts for the branch to try to adapt a highly requested setting into the format of a Saga title, whilst providing ample experience in a project that is seen as lower risk. The game released on the 13th of August 2020 as an Epic Games Store exclusive, and hoping to expand the Total War audience, was made free to claim for the first 24 hours of launch. The first DLC launched a month later, introducing a new faction group, the Amazons. A month after that, the Blood and Glory DLC, to add blood, gore, and dismemberment effects, your typical hyper-violent cosmetic DLC that always launches a couple of months after a new Total War release. The Ajax and Diomedes DLC launched in January of 2021, introducing the two respective Achaean heroes to the faction roster. The game was then launched for the Steam platform in September of 2021, Total War's accustomed platform of choice, and to perhaps remarket and re-pivot the game to its traditional fanbase. Accompanying this was a remarketing campaign and the release of a massive Mythos expansion pack and corresponding patch 1.6 to enhance the game with a new fantasy mode, heavily drawing on the mythology of ancient Greece. The Trojan War was a presumably historical conflict of the Bronze Age in which the Mycenaeans, the first advanced and distinctively Greek civilization of the ancient era, waged a large-scale war across the Aegean. There are remains of a large city believed to be sacked that corresponds to the region where ancient Troy was, at the same time frame as the Greeks understood it. That's as far as the true archaeological history is concerned, since the lack of reliable sources makes this subject matter difficult to study. However, most modern scholars agree that there is a historical basis to the legends of the Trojan War. Most of the stories about the war are taken from ancient literature written by classical Greeks and thus entwine much Greek mythology. Most notably are the works of Homer. His epic poems, the Iliad and Odyssey, cover the final days of the Trojan Siege and set the foundations for later works, including those from Roman poets such as Virgil's Aeneid, which elaborate on other parts of the conflict. All of the associated epic literature involve many themes associated with Greek mythology, tales of valor and heroics on the battlefield, themes of tragedies and romance, to divine intervention from the Olympian gods, to references of mythical beasts and creatures. The story itself is highly complex and subject to multiple interpretations. To summarize, Paris, a prince of Troy, falls in love with Helen, the most beautiful woman on earth, but married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Upon a Trojan diplomatic mission to secure peace with Sparta, Paris either elopes or abducts Helen, bringing her back to Troy as his princess. This incites Menelaus, who requests help from his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, to sail to Troy and take back Helen. Agamemnon had spent the last few years campaigning across Greece, consolidating the various kings and warlords into one homogeneous empire. Ambitious, he has always dreamed of conquering Troy, and sees Menelaus' spite as an opportunity to do so. In a vast call to arms, Agamemnon calls upon his allies and subjects to join his expedition. The Greeks eventually assemble a 1,000-ship armada to cross the Aegean Sea and lay siege to Troy. The Trojans, whose king Priam is respected but old and feeble, delegates responsibility of the defense of the city to Hector, his eldest son and Troy's best warrior. Troy itself is a rich and grandiose metropolis, the capital of a powerful and expansive kingdom, with equally impressive fortifications. Its walls were said to have been built by Poseidon and Apollo. According to legend, the city itself has never been conquered before. The Trojans call upon many allies across Asia Minor to its defense, whilst the Greeks assemble the largest expeditionary force ever in their history. Ultimately, the war stalemates into a protracted 10-year siege, the Greeks unable to breach the Trojan walls, whilst the Trojans unable to capitulate the Greek invaders. The stalemate is only overcome by a ruse formulated by the cunning mastermind Odysseus. He envisages a wooden horse offered to the Trojans, hollow on the inside and filled with a select group of elite soldiers, whilst the rest of the army return to their ships and feign sailing away. The Trojans accept the horse as a gift of concession, the horse being a symbol of Troy, wheeling the artifact into the city and unknowingly celebrate their successful defense. At night, the Greek soldiers embark off the horse, open the city gates and signal to the Greek fleet, which has sailed back under the cover of darkness. Troy is then pillaged, sacked and burnt to the ground, Agamemnon achieving his final victory. The ruse that ended the war has been immortalized through time as the fable of the Trojan horse. This is a rough outline of the premise, a captivating story, but not much of it is implemented into Total War Saga Troy, preferring to nudge the player along than retell the story. As we proceed with this review, we'll make references to how well the game adapts this source material. The saga of the Trojan War mentions a multitude of heroes, championed by the gods to perform extraordinary feats that shaped the fate of the conflict. Some of these key figures are represented into the game as epic heroes, leading their respective factions, similar to the character implementation of Warhammer 2 or 3 Kingdoms. As a result, there are no homogeneous factions with multiple famous heroes. In order to obtain other heroes, players must confederate them. Within the campaign, these epic heroes cannot be killed, only wounded, and feature unique campaign events, missions, and battle abilities. These heroes are split amongst two tribes, the Danans, a Homeric term for the Greeks, and the Trojans, each of them with a base roster of 4 playable heroes. The first is Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior and the central character of the Iliad. Odysseus the Cunning, who conceptualized the Trojan horse, Agamemnon, the supreme leader of all Greek forces, and his brother Menelaus, husband of Helen. Towering Ajax and Athena's favorite Diomedes is added with their namesake DLC. On the Trojan side, we have Hector, crown prince and Troy's best warrior, his younger brother Paris, whose escapade and elopement with Helen instigates the conflict. Aeneas, their loyal cousin protecting their north, while Sarpedon, leader of the Lycians, holds the south of the continent. With the Amazons DLC, 2 more hero factions are available to play, Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, and her younger sister, Penthesilea, who canonically assists the Trojans. Other notable characters can be found across the game world, sometimes leading their own non-playable factions, such as Nestor, Agamemnon's famous advisor. They are collectively known as Homeric characters, those who have been earmarked as noteworthy by Homer in his epics. Thusly, they cannot be killed, but only wounded, and usually have 1 or 2 unique skills and abilities. This includes Eudorus, one of Achilles' famous 5 commanders, or King Priam of Troy's other sons, such as Polydorus or Deiphobos. Many other characters appear in relation to story events or missions that unfold as the campaign progresses, such as Agamemnon receiving his son Orestes after the latter prevents a plot to overthrow his father's kingdom, or Patroclus, who joins Achilles' side when the Myrmidons gather their forces in preparation to sail for Troy. The murky historicity and lack of credible sources is actually taken advantage of by the developers, providing license to push the boundaries of the setting into a more mythical, fantasy-inspired world, if the player so chooses. With the latest anniversary DLC and patch cycle, this allowed the developers to implement 3 realism levels for Total War Saga Troy's campaign. For the sake of brevity, if we mention fantasy modes in this review, we mean the latter two. A historical mode, which contains virtually no mythological excesses and delivers a grounded approach to religiosity and warfare, portraying the Trojan War as nothing more than a conflict between nations. For the Bronze Age setting, this makes it one of the most bare bones and lackluster campaign experiences in Total War, but utilizes a more traditional battle engine where generals have bodyguard units, battles last longer with fatigue, and tactical maneuvers factoring in more heavily. The truth behind the Myth mode is a sort of middle ground and is the original vanilla mode before Mythos released. This mode attempts to interpret the Iliad's more fantastic elements with a truth grounded in reality. For instance, the Minotaur is not a half-bull, half-man creature, but an infamous bandit king of the island of Crete who wears a bull skull helmet to intimidate his foes. The campaign is more vibrant with unique buildings, allowing recruitment of equally unique units, re-envisioned from Greek mythology. Gods play an indirect role in this mode as opposed to religion being relegated to a passive role in the historical mode, granting unique units and in-battle buffs. Heroes are singular entities that have enough power to change the fates of battles, with units playing a secondary function but still quite important. This is comparable to Total War 3 Kingdoms Romance mode.
Your hero is under attack.
Mythos mode, which is only available if you own the Mythos expansion, is the highest fantasy setting of the Trojan War, portraying this event as a clash of heroes and their gods, the deities imbuing their champions with blessings such as Athena's wisdom or Hephaestus' armor, or administering their own direct destruction on the battlefield with godlike powers. Mythological combatants such as the Shadows of Elysium, Griffins and Centaurs essentially embrace the full embellishments and exaggerations of the Greek mythological legends, transforming the game into something resembling the Warhammer series. As we dive further into the gameplay later on in this video, we will offer comparisons between the 3 modes. A Total War Saga Troy's presentation can be adequately summarized as a charming reskin of Warhammer 2. There is a clear Bronze Age thematic touch, but it is evident the engine is very similar, if not the same iteration of engine as Warhammer 2, suggesting the game was developed concurrently with Total War 3 Kingdoms and thus didn't receive many of that game's noticeable improvements in its presentation. This is quite apparent in both games' overindulgence in sharpening, something toned down a lot in 3 Kingdoms, creating a shimmering effect on object edges. Despite this, the campaign map is absolutely gorgeous though, especially the water effects, and this is no surprise with the very coastal and aquatic nature of the Aegean region. This provides stunning vistas into the ancient Greek world, and of course has many important Greek localities such as Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, or the Oracle of Delphi, prophesizer of the gods. This has been enhanced with the day-night cycle, which debuted in Total War 3 Kingdoms. There are also major graphical differences on the campaign map between campaign modes, with historical considerably less vibrant color-wise, whilst the Mythos mode features more decorations in the form of bronze statues of mythical creatures, which can be hovered over to display a tooltip description. Places of interest to the Greek mythos are also scattered across the map and provide some more world building to the ancient Greek legends. Besides settlements which pretty much look the same irrespective of culture, it's certainly still the prettiest world setting in Total War thus far, just a shame it had to be done on this engine, which is clearly showing its age. Battle graphics are however much worse than the recent 3 Kingdoms and even less stimulating than Warhammer 2, as there are less visual effects to indulge the senses. Battles are drab, tedious affairs that get repetitive very quickly. In general, not so much that Total War Saga Troy suffers from a bad looking battle engine, it has virtually the same one as Warhammer 2, but the lack of effects variety really dampens the graphical atmosphere. There are no fire arrows in the game, whilst Mythos mode's spellcasting are essentially copied from Warhammer. Battles just don't look that good in this Total War. A redeeming factor is the Bronze Age themed unit designs, and although we can't deduce the historical authenticity, it's nevertheless effective in making distinct the Trojan and Greek alliances. The Trojans adorn purple, blue or greenish one-piece dress garments with an assortment of bronze fittings. The more elite the unit, the more the bronze they wear, kind of fitting. And most of the Trojan units do portray a heavier, tankier feel that is reflected in their playstyle. Trojan shields, for instance, are gigantic and concave, demonstrating their defensive prowess and dependency on formidable spearmen formations. The Greeks dress in more reddish-brown tones with a lighter but sleeker look, with separated thorax armor pieces, greaves, and exorbitant helmets, helping to define their assault-oriented playstyle. The Greeks employ the aspis rounded shield, resembling those later used by hoplites, a lighter shield for rapid movement and close-quarter combat dexterity. Heroes are also well done, and one of the best parts of this game's presentation. Each of the game's playable heroes are artistically rendered even to the detail of their jawlines, and their physical characteristics are obviously inspired by a certain movie. However, these designs are only applicable in certain screens such as faction selection or the character art in their details tab, and in no way reflected onto their in-game models. Outside of them, other heroes and even many of the lesser Homeric heroes seem to follow a generic template. Another essentially unchanged port from Warhammer 2 is Total War Saga Troy's user interface. It's also important to note that the UI has been altered recently with the latest anniversary update. To accommodate the new resource system, the upper interface is sprawled across the entirety of the top edge. The top left is where the management tabs are displayed, but this is in conjunction with the unique faction mechanics here as well, and I wish there was some differentiation between the two subsets. The bottom half UI is virtually the same as Warhammer 2, the only difference being the minimap is now merged with the bottom right section alongside the end turn button, the notifications tab, etc. Therefore, it is a relatable interface similar to the Warhammer series, making it easy to transition into, but doesn't quite have the refinement of, say, Total War 3 Kingdoms, which not only reduced the clutter of the UI with a cleaner design, but also appreciably stamped its visual aesthetic of the premise it represented, which I feel Total War Saga doesn't do that well since it looks like a Warhammer 2 clone. Richard Beto and Timothy Wynn reprised their roles as composers from their tour de force that is the Total War 3 Kingdoms soundtrack, quickly becoming one of my favourite soundtrack producers in the industry. In this title they combine elements of rock, electronic music, and ancient soundscapes in a Hans Zimmer-esque style. What I like most is their ability to convey a story with each piece, the Greek setting and the drama of the Trojan epics providing substantial inspiration to deliver another mesmerising soundtrack. Much of the campaign tracks are very atmospheric in this edition, lots of reverb used to convey a fever dream-like feeling, as if the Trojan War itself is something otherworldly. Despite its smaller scope and game size, Total War Saga Troy is somehow disappointingly unoptimized. Pretty similar to Warhammer 2's experience and offering little improvement. It takes a shorter amount of turns before encountering frame degradation, and I think it's actually related to the much more nicer campaign map design, but clearly porting over more particle effects and higher resolution textures was not accompanied by the same amount of engine optimization. Similar to Warhammer 2, it does not play well at all in borderless window mode. Battle performance is even more noticeable, a solid 10 to 20 FPS drop from 3 Kingdoms, even with a similar amount of units. Stability is also concerning as the game does tend to crash occasionally. There is a dreaded DRM fail, which is most likely from the game's use of de novo. Total War Saga Troy is also rife with bugs. After more than a year since release, there are a plethora of critical and game-breaking issues that can really hamper the experience. A few of those I've encountered include infamous sound bugs and visual artifacting, whilst many campaign bugs show up in historical mode, which makes me think this mode was the most neglected expected out of the 3 in the game at present. Total War Saga Troy presents itself as a side project that doesn't quite feature the polish and refinement of the mainline Total War series, even if its artistic direction is meritable. Since Total War Saga Troy is based on the engine of Warhammer 2, it plays extremely similar to it as well. There are a few key differences the developers tried to experiment with, possibly as a testing ground for mechanical reworks in future Total War titles. In this section, we'll take a look at these and examine their effects on the Total War Saga Troy's grand campaign experience. The first thing to note is the scope of the campaign map. This is quite a fleshed out map of the Greek peninsula, from the Peloponnese, the famous cities in Attica, to the plains of Thessaly all the way to Macedon in the north. Interestingly, the other side of the Aegean is also equally detailed, not just the Troad region where Troy lies, but much of the western Anatolian coastline as far south as Lycia, allowing the Trojans the possibility to recruit many Anatolian allies. But it's not just the Achaean Greeks and Trojans that are represented. Dorian tribes are present in the northwest, as well as the Thracians from the northeast, though the dominant culture on Anatolia at the time, the Hittites, do not make an appearance. Within the Aegean Sea itself, the developers have chosen to represent many islands. There are large, strategically and resource important islands such as Crete and Rhodes, but also a host of lesser chains such as the Cyclades, the Sporades and the Ionians, all of them with individual factions controlling them. This allows a very deep exploration into Greek mythological localities, as many events feature or allude references to these islands. At the same time, the design decision to include a vast array of islands dictates much of the gameplay experience, whether you are playing as either the Greeks or Trojans, as this comes to our first negative point upon the campaign. The fact that the map is centered on the huge Aegean Sea between 2 landmasses riddled with many islands automatically creates a very aquatic nature to military movement. It is an eventuality for factions to set sail and embark on maritime expeditions. The deep sea attrition mechanic means that armies must try to cross stretches of water as quickly as possible, or through stages by hopping across islands. This makes armies at sea quite vulnerable, allowing islands and consequently island nations to exert an overwhelming amount of influence on the campaign, because despite the map design creating a ripe playing field for naval warfare, there exist no naval units in the game. This means that when opposing armies meet at sea, they will embark at a nearby island and play out a land battle. This is a recent trend in Total War to forego naval units. This has been in Warhammer 2 and 3 Kingdoms, but the Homeric epics incorporate many tales of the Greek Armada and its hardships in crossing the Aegean, references to an assortment of maritime exploits during the 10-year siege, and of course most famously the Odyssey home after the war. Furthermore, historical sources suggest there was much naval warfare during the Late Bronze Age through the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, and of course the Mycenaean Greeks. As a result, there exists much inspiration and historical sources to incorporate naval units. The lack thereof makes the one-dimensional army management, with the inability to explore this rich maritime landscape, a chore. If there isn't naval units and consequently naval battles as part of the game package, which I maybe can understand given the game's smaller scope and budget as a Saga title, at least provide some sort of new mechanic to make it more intriguing than just right-clicking the other side of the Aegean. Another issue that presents itself is the sheer amount of factions present on the campaign map. This may sound like a nitpick because I do enjoy playing on a more expansive map, but there are too many factions that could have been consolidated into larger groupings for a more refined experience. The main reason is because despite it being a Total War game based on a conflict between the Achaeans and the Trojans, there's too many possible enemies or allies that can either disrupt or bog down progression towards major objectives. In fact, Total War's classic sandbox formula of forging an empire from 1 or 2 small provinces shouldn't really apply here, because in my opinion, a Saga title should propel players into the primary narrative as quickly as possible. On higher difficulties, this really poses a problem because single region minor factions can still field 1 or 2 full stacks, impeding progress. Island factions are even more problematic as they can suddenly interdict naval forces and make crossing the Aegean a nightmare. Ultimately, this forces a consolidation approach where players have to shore up their home base and slowly pacify minor factions before taking on grander objectives. Certain settlements on the campaign map feature unique building chains, providing access to mythical units or global buffs, a direct mechanical port from Warhammer 2. In the two fantasy modes, regions are also home to endemic mythical creatures. Giants, for instance, can be found in Euboea. Building the respective chain allows recruiting units of the giant class. Similar to Fia, where centaurs can be recruited. Unique buildings can be constructed at certain settlements also, such as Apollo's Sacred Way at Miletus, Apollo's Oracle at Mykonos, or Artemis's Sacred Hunting Grounds on Eos. In historical mode, however, none of these features exist, making the incentive to capture certain settlements mute. There are some unique buildings that have archaeological evidence, such as Mycenae's Cyclopean Walls or the baths at Pylos, but this is where, in this mode, I would have liked to see the Wonders mechanic come back into play. Why is there no bonus for occupying the sacred site at Delphi? Why is there no bonus for controlling the region surrounding Mount Olympus? Even though historical mode is meant to be, well, historic, surely the ancient Greeks would be somewhat inspired within their grace of the holy mountain. It just makes historical mode very bland and lackluster compared to the other two. Some locations are just eye candy in all three modes, despite the developers putting in the effort to enrich the world map with many fascinating places of interest. Philoterra's volcano or the Nisuros crater as an example, the eternal flame of Marinos and Polyocne's city of the dead on the island of Lemnos are some more. Hovering over these places provides tooltips that discuss their relevance to Greek mythology, yet provide no gameplay whatsoever. Troy is the most famous city on the map, and features some unique attributes important to know for both the Greeks attacking the city and the Trojans defending it. The city starts as a tier 5 building that cannot be demolished. It has a plus 12 turn siege holdout time, a permanent modifier that makes the city immune to hostile agent actions. Fighting a battle against the city of Troy can never be auto-resolved. Moreover, it has a powerful garrison that replenishes at an astonishing rate, and a permanent garrisoned full stack army under Deiphobos, featuring the most elite troops in the Trojan roster at double golden experience. As a result, the developers have ensured that Troy, the ultimate city of the game's setting, cannot simply be cheesed by players. We'll see later that it doesn't really matter. In an age where currency was not widely adopted yet, the opportunity for testing a new resource system in a Total War game has arisen. In previous Total Wars, income and expenses were simplified to use a global currency. In Total War Saga Troy, there are now 5 resources to juggle and barter: food, wood, stone, bronze, and gold, in order of their rarity on the campaign map. Each province will feature a region capital and up to 3 resource producing minor settlements. Food is the most basic resource and is used for many purchases and to pay for upkeep. Wood is the primary building resource. Stone allows construction of more advanced buildings and fortifications. Bronze is used for recruitment and upkeep of advanced units. And finally, gold is the rarest and most valuable resource, used to pay for the most elite troops and fund brilliant monuments. Interestingly, there is a theoretical cap of maximum gold in any campaign. Gold mines, which are exceedingly rare on the campaign map already, have a finite amount of gold that can be extracted, depleted mines only producing a trickle of gold per turn. Yet gold is required to reach the later tier 4 and tier 5 buildings and units. Similarly, bronze is also hard to come by. In my Mycenaean campaign, in which I conquered virtually all of central and southern Greece, I only had access to about 8 bronze forges out of a total of 75 settlements owned, barely enough to sustain elite troops for all my armies. This starvation of late game resources, among other mechanics, makes the late game of Total War Saga Troy quite interesting, because it is no longer full stacks upon full stacks of the highest tier elite units. Armies often have to forego certain units because of resource constraints, and this adds a nice strategic element to unit selection. For the first time in a Total War late game scenario, there is a great variety and combination of early, mid, and late game army compositions encountered. Another great indirect positive of the new resource system is how it greatly improves the dynamics of trade, which has been renamed to a more fitting barter system. Factions can barter resources in one-off amounts or spread over multi-turn installments. Each faction will also have differing perceptions of certain resources. Factions that produce plenty of wood will generally place a lower value on wood and refrain from seeking it in barter agreements, for instance. This resource diplomacy thus is similar to how you would barter in Settlers of Catan, each player prioritizing each of the resources and having differing short-term and long-term goals. Income and upkeep have always kind of been one-dimensional in the Total War series, and this new system is a promising prelude to better micromanagement of resources. It's nowhere near perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. Consequently, diplomacy is more interactive as barter opportunities provide a greater frequency of deal making, but it is let down by a recurring theme in this game, a terrible AI. Firstly, it seems on all difficulties the AI is ultra aggressive to the point of being suicidal, ignoring their strength and declaring war on the player knowing full well they can get wiped out in the next 3-4 turns. Having too many factions is also a hindrance coupled with this AI, as it makes controlling massive alliances a huge struggle. Because each hero commands their own faction, there are too many separate factions yet with the same overarching objectives. This is fine for maybe the Achaean Greeks to do this, as kings such as Menelaus, Achilles and Odysseus were under the command of Agamemnon, which is respectful to the source material. However, the Trojans being separated, especially Paris and Hector leading their own factions whilst vying for the Trojan throne, is disingenuous, I feel, to the overall tone of their attempt for a unified defense of the city. This creates an overwhelming overdependence on the AI to do the right thing. It's impossible, for instance, to coordinate a combined, simultaneous Greek expedition to Troy. Sure, the game features the war target mechanic, but the AI will take several turns to direct their armies towards said target, and more often than not suicide their full stack without waiting for support. Similarly, on the other side, it's hard to tell the AI to focus on defense. Paris goes off on random expeditions in Asia Minor, whilst Menelaus sacks his capital in the Troad region. When the Greeks finally start arriving, albeit in disjointed waves because the AI can't seem to coordinate amongst themselves either, it's usually on the onus of the player to defend Troy because the other Trojan allies are busy suiciding themselves into Greek territory. Because of the AI, the player will feel compelled to confederate their allies. However, this is disincentivized by the developers' introduction of the administration system. Let me preface this by saying Total War has always had a system in place to check the player's progression and as a means to stop the player from expanding too quickly without equal investment in their economy. But Total War Saga Troy's administration system, however, is the most arbitrary artificial difficulty mechanic I've ever experienced in the entire series. The more settlements in your realm, the more armies you field, the more agents you recruit, even some buildings you choose to construct will add into your administration tier and force greater and greater penalties on the income of your resources. This is similar to Total War 3 Kingdom's corruption mechanic, but unlike that game, there isn't a clear-cut way to reduce it. So even if you have the largest empire on the map, 100 settlements under your banner, and a bustling economy, your income will be very measly and you will be barely able to field enough armies to match the scale of your realm. This system greatly punishes empire building and encourages vassalage and alliance making instead. It's also funny that once you reach the final administration tier, there's no more caps after that, so no matter how greater you expand after this, in the ultra late game it doesn't matter anyway. Like, what's the point? Is it just to inhibit the player's mid-game experience? For a game based on character-driven literature, the exploration of its heroes is fundamentally shackled by its lack of characterization. The epic heroes who lead their factions and armies are employed into an identical system to Warhammer 2. The skill tree is a single branch with a pick one of two options. These can be buffs to stats, new abilities, or if on historical mode, new bodyguard units. Some of these are unique and only available to certain heroes. However, much of the generic and lesser heroes have similar skill trees that are templates of their class. Defenders will have the same skill tree as other defenders, for instance. At the beginning of the campaign, heroes will start with a lineage based on their ancestral trait, as well as an epic hero trait based on their Homeric biography in literature, but gain more as they complete missions or perform certain actions on the campaign map. This evolving trait system is not a new feature in the series, but more depth has been given here to develop the characters based on their actions. If characters stay in certain provinces for a period of time, they can gain a resource producing buff. If they spend many turns at sea, they can gain a bonus to their movement range and naval stance. If a character defeats another Homeric epic hero in battle, they will receive a buff related to the defeated hero's speciality. Now this is all well and dandy, but what's lacking is some sort of relationship mechanic to elevate the drama, especially since in the Homeric epics these characters interacted frequently. Outside of scripted events, there's no organic development of personal stories, one that Three Kingdoms' Wu Xing system does very well. What is new is the motivation system. Each hero besides the faction leader has a certain motivation from -10 to +10. The lower the value, the more ineffective they are at command, vice versa. Each hero can gain or lose motivations depending on certain campaign actions related to their personality. Now this is a pretty neat gimmick to differentialize each of the heroes, give them some impetus and aspiration, but it is nowhere near deep as Total War Three Kingdoms' satisfaction system. Moreover, there's no real danger to low motivation. Heroes don't just move around other factions, and sure, you get a considerable penalty, but nothing devastating. The faction leader also doesn't have their own motivation attached to them, and the heroes that do have their motivations randomized every campaign, which doesn't really make sense from a consistency point of view. So the game doesn't feature a relationship system, but there is the antagonist mechanic, where an AI hero will declare themselves as the sworn enemy to the player hero once the campaign progresses far enough, intending to force a direct conflict between the two factions. Now on paper this is great, right? More dynamism to relationships in which the stories of the Trojan conflict featured much animosity between the heroes, though it has almost no effect on the gameplay. There's no bonuses or buffs when fighting against the antagonist faction. All it does is script the AI into playing more aggressively against you, which once again the player can cheese and take advantage of. Funnily enough, you can also ally with the antagonist faction and sometimes even receive gifts from them. Another seemingly makeshift mechanic haphazardly added into the game without much testing. There's a whole host of other criticisms with how the game represents heroes. For instance, there's a real lack of other fleshed out epic heroes besides the one available as faction leaders. All the other Homeric characters have default skill tree templates, generic portraits and models, greatly reducing replayability and variety, such as Nestor or Ajax the Lesser. You also can't capture other heroes outside of confederating their faction. Furthermore, although you can equip armor or weapons as you play through the campaign, these don't have any effect cosmetically, and inside battles, the heroes will still use their pre-designed model and animations. Yes, agents return in Total War Saga Troy, given even more powerful license in the campaign. There are three typical agents: the Spy, Envoy, and Priestess. These agents all have assorted abilities when they are passively standing, when attached with an army, or when acting against hostile or friendly settlements / characters. There are also 5 epic agents available when you play in the fantasy modes: the Gorgon, Satyr, Seer, Orion, and Divine Craftsman. These become available to recruit once an affinity with their respective god has been reached, with absurdly broken abilities. Agents add so much clutter to the map, they cause frustration and headache more than satisfaction, and increase the lag and just waste the player time. Three Kingdoms showed how agents could have been reworked with its new spy mechanic. For the Trojan setting, it's an interesting way to involve some of the more mythological creatures and figures, but the quicker Total War can move away from this outdated mechanic of singular agents, the better, in my opinion. The events and mission system of the game is actually quite pleasing. Almost every new turn there's something happening on the world that affects your heroes or faction, whether that be natural disasters or excerpts from the Iliad played out onto the campaign. It all complements the world building. Many present themselves as dilemmas, allowing the player to select the path best befitting their desires. The missions in the game serve as lucrative rewards, directing players to certain objectives in order to receive powerful boons or a heap of resources. Every faction will also have an epic mission chain that is adapted from their character's story arc in the Homeric epics. Finishing these are required to achieve victory in the campaign, and often will send heroes all over the Greek world. The game is thus very proficient at covering the deeper, more obscure sub-stories on the heroes themselves, but struggles to carve the holistic story at large, never providing the urgency to advance the Trojan conflict at an acceptable pace. It's like the campaign will teach you everything about the background biography of your hero, but yet barely scratch the surface of the Trojan War. Religion is quintessential in ancient Greece, and likewise in the campaign. In the Divine Will tab, players can pay homage to 9 gods and goddesses of the Greek pantheon, gain favour through offering hecatombs or constructing respective temples, which provides global buffs at each of the 3 cult levels. Further gain more powerful limited turn effects when players initiate a prayer ritual. This is a great strategic and flavorful mechanic that allows factions to sort of specialize themselves. Since favor decays over time, resources, especially gold, must be used to maintain the desired cult levels, and thus the player faction will really only be able to focus on 1 or 2 gods effectively. Athena, for instance, is very desired by Hector's faction, with their affinity towards shielded spear units and a defensive approach, whereas Artemis should be the chosen deity for Paris or Odysseus, both of which field a strong core of ranged units. Not just military buffs, but Aphrodite improves public order and growth, whilst Hephaestus increases resource production. In Mythos mode, the gods can directly intervene the battle with devastating abilities activated by the player on command. The higher the favor levels, the more activations of said skills. I'm not sure why the developers decided not to just add all the 12 Olympians. I feel there is a place for Demeter, Dionysus and Hermes as well in the religion mechanics, just to have the full complement of gods and goddesses for flavor reasons. Overall though, this is a wonderful addition to the campaign. It's a sort of pseudo resource the player must juggle but can take advantage of. Of course, each faction will have their own separate mechanics. This is nothing new, but unlike other Total War games, there are at least 2 major mechanics each faction gets to play with. Hector's faction features the Asurn League, as Hector attempts to forge alliances with the Anatolian kingdoms to assist in the defense of the city. The more territories him and his allies control, the greater his global effects, which include morale, campaign movement, and recruitment cost reduction. At the same time, he must convince his father, Priam, of his rightful birthright, contesting the throne of Troy with his brother Paris in the Priam's heir mechanic. By fulfilling certain objectives and demonstrating administrative acumen, as well as undermining your brother, Hector slowly progresses through benevolent stages, each providing greater and greater buffs. Another example is Agamemnon, whom features the King of Men mechanic. This allows him to place noteworthy characters into key advisory positions to improve their motivation and confer buffs onto his faction, similar to appointing ministers in Three Kingdoms. His other mechanic is the Lion's Share, forcing vassals to provide resources per turn, whilst also allowing Agamemnon to demand tribute at the cost of diplomatic respect. Let's talk about the Mythos DLC and what it adds to the campaign. On the surface, the Mythos DLC is a dramatic re-envisioning of the campaign to embrace Greek mythology to its fullest. Mythos mode is more vibrant, it includes new units and adds godly battle abilities, but the creme de la creme of the expansion pack is its focus on 3 mythic monsters, the Griffin, the Hydra and the Cerberus. 15 turns into a Mythos mode campaign, expeditions will unlock. The player must first select one of 3 monsters to target, with all their lore, details, stats and mechanics comparable on this screen. Once selected, the player must assemble a hunting party by choosing a leader from their hero pool and recruiting units from the available faction roster. A strength gauge is available to assess the potential success of this expedition, and it is advised to start them once strong mid or high tier units are available. Once begun, every few turns the expedition will advance, generating a 4-choice dilemma. Similar to a roguelike mechanic, subsequent dilemmas and the overall strength of your expeditionary force will be influenced by these player decisions, the expedition culminating into a finale fight against the respective monster. You defeat the monster and its followers, and it will join your faction as an epic mythical agent, capable of attaching with armies and delivering death to your enemies, or interacting on the campaign map alongside some new buildings unlocked related to that particular monster. Mythical armies will occasionally appear on the campaign map in Mythos mode. The Shades of Elysium represent the underworld followers of Cerberus, the priests and pilgrims coveting the Lernian Hydra, or the tribal outlanders seeking the Noble Griffin. Defeating these armies yields mythical units from the respective monster group into the special recruit pool. Despite there being a multitude of different factions and their differing inherent mechanics, the Greeks and Trojan alliances generally have the same overarching goals, and it's thus convenient to assess the progression of the campaign from each of their perspectives. Players cannot play as Troy itself, King Priam in the canonical sense, but you can play as his two most famous sons, Hector and Paris. Hector starts off in the eastern parts of the Trojan region, and his epic mission chain delegates his role to something of a conquering diplomat, to pacify or ally with the minor tribes around Troy, securing its boundaries before focusing on its defense against the Greeks. Paris, meanwhile, is more concerned with staying near Helen. If the couple are separated for an extended period of time, Paris's faction can incur happiness penalties, whilst she can be moved around by Paris to different provinces, providing benefits to the local populace. Besides Sarpedon and Aeneas, who lead separate agendas, the two brotherly princes don't possess the full potential of their faction until King Priam declares a worthy heir. So Hector and Paris must contest the rights to succession in the meanwhile by impressing their father. Hector and Paris's relationship is therefore painted as a competition from the start, providing no impetus to the player to assist his brother in the name of Troy, and perhaps even encourages sabotaging the other brother as a direct rival to the throne. Only after the heir of Troy is decided that they unite under one faction, one banner. Clearly it has to be this way given the game separates the Homeric heroes into individual factions, but it's disingenuous to the Trojan defense having competing princes. And a note on Helen. Only Paris of Troy and Menelaus, king of Sparta, can interact with her directly. Other factions that capture the territory in which she is present will receive the buffs, but nothing more to interact with her. For such a pivotal character of the epics, in which the entire conflict was fought over her in the first place, it is kind of disheartening to see her relegated to a minor role. Eventually, the Greeks will arrive, but they are so partitioned that it's simply a mopping up exercise as Greek armies invade at the closest settlements. There is never a unified front by the Greek alliance, no 1,000-ship armadas across the horizon bringing about a feeling of dread or doom. Each Greek faction will arrive individually in their own wave, ready to be decimated, rinse and repeat. The Achaean heroes will never arrive at once to present a sustained threat. It kinda makes me wish for a scripted event such as Attila the Hun or the Mongol invasion of Medieval 2, or even the Chaos invasion of Warhammer, when the Greeks arrive all at once, although this definitely takes away the sandbox Total War feeling and is perhaps not the best way to execute it in regards to difficulty. Probably the most pressing issue, however, is that the Trojan victory is only achieved after destroying or subjugating the Greeks. Why is that the case? After defending against endless Greek expeditions, the last thing I want to do as the Trojans is to assemble my own expedition, sail across the Aegean, and repeat what was done to me. Victory should be achieved by retaining certain parts of the Trojan realm whilst defeating the Greek armies or heroes a certain amount of times, otherwise the campaign is just too laborious to finish. The Greeks don't seem to suffer nearly as much counterproductivity simply due to the fact that they are the aggressors and their final objective is to sack Troy. In fact, many Greek heroes have expansive epic mission chains that allow them to establish their home base first and guide them into the conflict against Troy second, a much more linear but clearer campaign progression path. Achilles has to assemble the Myrmidons, Odysseus must subdue the Teleboan pirates, whilst Menelaus must crush a rebellion before gathering his allies. However, the ability to control the entire Greek alliance is simply a pipe dream. The game seems balanced to discourage empire making and instead it encourages vassalage with its punishing administration mechanic. However, since the AI is so terrible, controlling vassals and trying to coordinate military expeditions across multiple factions is also impossible. The Greek AI will spend the early campaign fighting petty wars amongst each other, and in the late game they will launch solo attacks against Troy that inevitably fail. Only Agamemnon, quite fittingly, has the best pathway to commanding a Greek alliance with his King of Men mechanic, making it worthwhile to confederate the other Greek heroes, but ironically his Lion's Share mechanic also encourages the opposite playstyle. Even then, pacifying Greece is no easy feat. It took me 100 or so turns to establish a stable Greek empire as Mycenae, before even thinking about embarking against the Trojans. Furthermore, it is impossible to leave the Greek homelands undefended on higher difficulties because of the ridiculous number of AI factions that can become hostile at a moment's notice. This is again where an ultra-aggressive AI coupled with faction bloat pays out. Perhaps it is better to keep a small power base and just raise everything else, but the thirst for resources such as bronze and gold makes it impossible to not colonize or occupy settlements, in turn accruing your administration tier and punishing you anyway. Furthermore, the lack of dedicated naval units and resource constraints makes it extremely difficult to defend isolated islands and remote locations. The final assault on Troy is also extremely anticlimactic, hardly the 10-year siege that was purported in the epics. Besieging the city begins an event chain that results in the construction of a Trojan horse. Depending on method of choice, the Trojan horse can be a siege tower modelled in the likeness of a horse, or an actual hollow vessel that smuggles troops into the city. The time frame from landing in front of Troy to razing the city can take as little as 3 or 4 turns. Trojans will usually sally out of their walls for a battle during this time, but if the Greeks resoundingly defeat them, then they will refrain from attempting that again. I wish upon sieging Troy it would trigger more references from the Iliad, the countless skirmishes outside the walls, the construction of the Achaean wall to resist those attacks, the duels between the heroes, the sacking of the Temple of Apollo, the growing disillusionment in the Greek forces, only for Odysseus to figure out the ruse that is the Trojan horse. Troy on the Total War campaign map does not feel like an exceedingly special city. It feels more like a very difficult and time-consuming siege battle. Funnily enough, in the final battle for Troy, you can even cheese and just rush the victory point. For a city that had never fallen against any opponent, its imperviousness echoing through the throes of history, for even an entire series of epic poems written about the struggles outside and inside its walls, the Siege of Troy deserves almost a mini campaign in itself. The namesake city of this Total War game cannot be glorified in any less significance. Total War Saga Troy's campaign is overall a shallower experience holistically compared to other richer and more fulfilling Total War games, which is fine to expect from a Saga title. However, it is mired by so many questionable campaign design decisions that conclusively make it the most frustrating, hair-pulling experience of any Total War. Many of the systems don't interact well with each other, compounded by a severe lack of polish. There are some innovation with new mechanics, but it is impaired by terrible AI and considerable bugs. What's more, despite trying to appeal to fans of realism, historical mode features no special buildings, unique units, and specially crafted events, purposefully imposing an extremely vanilla and lackluster experience. It is purportedly more realistic, just staggeringly boring. It's a disappointing indicator to Total War Saga Troy that out of all the campaigns I've started, I can never muster the motivation to ever fully finish one, something that I don't struggle with in other Total War titles. Late Bronze Age warfare is difficult to adapt. This is the earliest historical period represented in Total War, so there's not much history to draw from. Instead, the developers embraced the concept of the Greek heroic age, when battles were more or less won on the tips of swords wielded by daring heroes rather than the disciplined military systems in place later on. Because of the smaller scale of unit sizes in this Total War, Battles feel more like retinues of the heroes skirmishing with each other rather than large structured armies performing grand maneuvers. According to in-game text, unit rosters are reflective of the late Bronze Age fighting styles. The spear and shield were commonplace, forming a mainstay in Trojan forces, but swords were increasingly preferred by the Greeks. As a result, there is a clear unit identity between the two faction tribes based on their respective defensive and offensive strategies. The game is almost entirely focused on infantry. Cavalry is non-existent, accurately reflective of the lack of horsemanship in the region at this time, with horses reserved only for chariots. There are 4 obvious melee infantry types present in the game: spears, swords, axes, and clubs, with a further subtype depending on whether they are two-handing their weapons or using a shield. However, this game also introduces weapon switching, where shielded units can switch to two-handed and thus gain better offensive stats if the need arises, allowing a greater degree of tactical flexibility. Shielded spearmen are generally the heaviest frontline units with great survivability. Trojans are distinguished in this typing, fielding the aptly named Guards of Troy with their heavy bronze armor and gigantic figure-8 shields. Greek variants trade defensive stats for more versatile spreaded stats, such as Achilles' spearfighting Myrmidons, who can perform offensive functions as well. Two-handed spearmen have a multi-purpose role in this game. The light armor variants are quick on their feet, great at circumventing the front line, and delivering their high charge bonus to the rear or sides of enemy formations, virtually a replacement for the lack of cavalry, with most factions having access to them. Labeled as chargers or shock spears, they will be used in the entirety of the early and mid-game as an effective way to break morale. Heavier versions of these are fielded by the Greeks as elite specialists. Their anti-large capability makes them adept at bringing down mythical creatures. Agamemnon's guards are the best in the business, but other Greek factions will have access to elite marines, known as the Pelagic Thessalians. All the swordsmen in this game are shielded, and they are your generalist all-rounders, with medium damage, medium melee attack and defense stats. They can do a job on the front line, but they are more adept at flanking. The Achaean Greeks excel in this typing, fielding strong sword units such as Odysseus' Warriors of Ithaca, though Hector can field some comparably strong units with his chosen swordsmen. Axes are your shield breakers and armor piercers. 1v1 against heavy shielded units, they excel, but often die too quickly in the thick of battle, and in my opinion they are too vulnerable to be effective. They're further hampered by the lack of factions with access to them. Some elite two-handed axemen, such as Agamemnon's companions or Lycian champions, are some of the hardest hitting units in the game though, and useful as a final battle decider. Clubs discharge high damage output but struggle against armor and shields. They are therefore strong in the early game or against lighter units, falling off later. I generally ignore them unless they are heavier elites, with the Trojans fielding some decent club units such as the Trojan Defenders or Aeneas' Dardanian Sworn Fighters. Ranged units play a considerably lessened role in this edition of Total War thanks to a nerf of projectile armor piercing damage across the board, but they're still useful to add an edge to engagements. Javelins are the king of ranged in this game. Although they require some micromanagement, they deliver devastating damage, especially when positioned at the rear of enemy formations. Skirmishers are capable in the early game, but even in the late game, heavier javelinmen with round shields can even perform an admirable effort as emergency melee infantry. The Greeks excel at javelinmen, Odysseus fielding the best with his ambusher units. Slingers possess the longest range but lack penetration. Thus, they are very useful at eliminating other ranged units. In longer engagements, they can still provide consistent damage against melee infantry. Slinger parity is pretty even amongst the Greeks and Trojans, with both sides capable of fielding a range of lighter homegrown units and more exotic elite units. On the other hand, archers have lost their dominance atop the Total War ranged infantry tier list. They offer more armor-piercing damage compared to slingers and have more staying power due to better defensive stats, but ironically, their lesser range puts them at a disadvantage against slingers directly. Unless you're playing a specific faction that buffs archer units such as Paris, who can field the mighty Trojan nobles and Trojan princes, it is fine to ignore them. This is an area the Greeks are pretty weak at, with the Trojan factions fielding far better archer units. Chariots can be considered the elite luxury units of the game. Their toughness and speed makes them formidable line breakers to disrupt enemy formations, but their expense makes them hard to justify for most armies. Despite this, their unique role on the battlefield is unrivaled and it's difficult to counter, so they do offer a cutting edge advantage to otherwise infantry-centric battles. Lighter chariots are very proficient at destroying backlines and chasing retreating units, whilst reinforced chariots are powerful hammers delivered into the thick of battle to tear through the front lines. The Greeks definitely suffer from a lack of chariot variety, whilst Trojan factions wield a diverse range of use cases, from skirmish chariots such as Paris's noble bow chariots, to Sarpedon's Lycian winged chariots, and heavy Anatolian variants armed with long spears. Mythical creatures are global units available in small numbers to all factions. They only appear in the 2 fantasy modes and depending on which are adapted differently. For instance, harpies and sirens are light javelin women and slingers in Truth Behind the Myth, whilst fantastical flying half-woman, half-bird creatures in Mythos. As such, they are often unique auxiliary units great at providing range support to the army body in Truth Behind the Myth, but in Mythos they offer a greater purpose as flying shock troops. In both the fantasy modes, the lack of cavalry can often be compensated by the centaurs. Realistically, they are tribal horse riders from the exotic Greek lands on the periphery, but in Mythos they are represented as true half-men, half-horse creatures. Giants, on the other hand, provide extremely hardy frontline mercenaries, men that tower in build and height over their adversaries in Truth Behind the Myth. In Mythos, they are gigantic creatures descended from the Titans themselves. There are also 3 mythical heroes recruitable from specific regions once at max favor with certain gods. They provide an overwhelming advantage to whoever they pledge allegiance to. The Cyclops is Poseidon's chosen, a master craftsman who wields a giant club and wears a dwarf mammoth skull helmet in Truth Behind the Myth. In Mythos, the Cyclops is a one-eyed giant who fought for the Olympians against the Titans. The Cyclops is nevertheless a huge damage dealer in both modes and can toss boulders or swing his club in devastating fashion. The Corybantes are Hera's favoured. In Truth Behind the Myth, they are elite spear and shield warriors wearing a brilliant lion's head. In Mythos, they are half men, half lion creatures born from Zeus himself. In both modes, they are a tanky specialist, adept at anti-large action, used to plug holes in the line and directly contest other monsters on the battlefield. Finally, the Minotaur, Zeus's champion. In Truth Behind the Myth, the Minotaur is a Cretan bandit king who wears a bull's helmet. In Mythos mode, he is reprised as the legendary horned guardian of the labyrinth. In both modes, his extremely high armor-piercing damage makes swings of his axe cleave through even the toughest of troops, whilst his bull rush and savage roar provides him good mobility and offensive ability. A Mythos DLC exclusive, 3 Gigantuan monsters can join the battle if they have been challenged and bested with the Expeditions mechanic. The Griffin Patriarch pulls Apollo's chariot in the sky. They are giant chimeras of lion and eagle. Since they fly, their mobility is unrivaled, and as such they are destructive shock units that can weave and wind in and out of battle. The Lernaean Hydra is a cataclysmic 9-headed serpent whom guards the entrance to the underworld. In the game, they are super tanky, walking siege engines, firing at immense range their poison attacks, spouting poison bombs, or even breathing poison gusts at close range. Their regenerating abilities makes them near immortal. Finally, the Cerberus, 3-headed hellhound of Hades, god of the underworld. Content in the thick of action, the Cerberus revels in death, causing morale-breaking fear to all enemies around it. It has useful frontline abilities such as summoning the shades of hell to do their master's bidding, or erupting veins of flame from hell itself. In and around this dazzling array of units, there are the Homeric heroes themselves. In historical mode, they are supported by a unit of bodyguards, but in the fantasy modes, they are singular entities that tower over the common soldier. With their abilities and fighting prowess, the battle will be dictated by their actions. They can also be mounted with chariots to provide extra maneuverability on the battlefield. The game heavily incentivizes your hero to be constantly fighting and in the thick of action all the time with the Rage and Aristeia mechanic. Rage is built up as a meter as they deal damage and is needed to activate abilities. Aristea, on the other hand, accrues very slowly throughout your hero's combat fighting and ability usage. Once activated though, Aristea provides no cooldown for abilities, HP healing, armor and attack bonus, stamina freezing, and an unbreakable status. This is the critical moment needed to push the advantage or finish off the battle, as your hero will be at the absolute peak of their performance during this stage. Despite its wonderful campaign map, Total War Saga Troy offers the least battle map variety. They seem to be constantly the same design with a fresh coat of paint for each region. Cliffs and rocky outcrops dot the battlefield, making mobility around these features key. There is never enough of a contiguous flat surface to fight a true line-to-line massive battle. As a result, there is a heightened emphasis on skirmish actions, as battles will often devolve into separated affairs. Moving the hero around to important actions is key, otherwise they will not generate enough rage and eventually Aristea to decide the battle. Targeting enemy heroes with your own are valid, though unlike Three Kingdoms for instance, there isn't a system to distract them or force a duel, and this just makes me wish for a duels mechanic, because this setting would have been perfect for it given the immense amount of hero versus hero actions described in the text. Some heroes do have access to a divine challenge ability to force a pseudo duel between the two characters, but this only lasts for a temporary duration. Honestly though, in the two fantasy modes, there is never really any onus for intricate tactical play. The overpoweredness of heroes and deploying higher damaging units and just damage racing is the main method to overwhelm enemies. There's hardly any point to rigid defensive formation play, since powerful units such as heroes, chariots, mythicals, monsters, or even abilities from the Olympians themselves will just straight up destroy any cohesion. As a result, battles, especially in Mythos mode, are just inherently chaotic and not really fun. Units are there to just be damage sponges, whilst the player will be more concerned with moving around their bigger and badder singular entities. In historical mode, since unit stats and morale are much more important, the battles are often much slower and manageable tactically. There is a huge emphasis on flanker units, or units that have the speed and charge bonus to truly wreck morale, so countering flanking plays are crucial. I think the lack of cavalry in historical mode actually makes the battles last longer, and this may be appealing to the historical purist. Chariots only provide the real cavalry-like function in this mode, but they are somewhat clunky and cumbersome.
Victory is close enough to taste.
Sieges are also very one-dimensional. Besides some major cities like Troy or Mycenae, all the sieges seem to use the same map. In this game, a huge advantage is always on the defensive side due to the lack of siege engines. There is battering rams to break down gates, but only once the Trojan horse is researched is there a siege tower to protect troops assaulting the walls directly. It's almost always better to just run down the timer in sieges on the campaign map and force the opponent to sally forth. In Mythos, the presence of flying units drastically alters the advantage to the attacker. Flying units are so adept at confusing the siege AI and killing ranged units that it gives plenty of distraction to climb the walls and deploy into the interior citadel. In conclusion, the battle experience is absolutely determined by which mode you are playing. On historical mode, battles are methodically slow, but kind of tedious and uninteresting. It is formulaic Total War to a T, but so bare bones with its stripped features. On Mythos, the battles are so intrinsically chaotic that it's hard to have any semblance of Total War tactics. This mode especially tries to be too much like Warhammer 2, without the high fantasy variety that comes with it. Units introduced into Mythos are also too overpowered. Extreme balance issues make battles boil down to whichever side can dish out higher damage numbers. Perhaps the best battle experience is somewhere in between, with the truth behind the Mythos mode. Perhaps the most disappointing performance from this whole Saga title is the frequency and quality of updates and DLC. The first 6 months of release saw the introduction of the Amazons and Ajax and Diomedes DLC, with many patches during this time, but suddenly a 6-month hiatus before the developers delivered a massive anniversary update, Steam release and Mythos DLC in what seems like a final hurrah before signing off. I have to remind myself that this is a Saga title, so extended support shouldn't be expected, but having dived quite deep into this game and dissected it over the past few months, it still feels really unpolished and messy despite more than a year of post-release development. Let's take a look at all the non-cosmetic DLCs and what they have to offer. The Amazons DLC launched in September of 2020 introduces a new female-only tribe, the Amazons, and 2 heroes to lead the warrior woman society. Amazons don't follow the conventional unit typings and categories in this game, having access to cavalry for instance, rendering them instantly unique against the Trojan and Greek archetypes. They do lack heavily armored troops and tanky frontline soldiers however. The DLC also introduces a global unit, the Followers of Artemis, female archer warriors that are available to all factions at high affinity with the goddess Artemis. Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons, is concerned with securing a peaceful future for her tribe. As such, she is officially neutral to the greater conflict at large, but is situated in Anatolia and thus may be pressured from the Trojans up north. The common Amazon warriors are simple and inferior, but with experience they can be initiated into more powerful specialized units. Hippolyta's Amazon Kingdom mechanic encourages her to settle sacred regions across the Aegean. These accrue Amazonian treasures which can be used to unlock milestones and assist the kingdom's progression. Penthesilea, the vengeful younger sister of Hippolyta, witnessed the destruction of Themyscira at the hands of the Achaeans and vows to return the favour. Thus, she joins the Trojan effort with her epic hero mission chain, developing her hatred towards the Greeks and directing her west across the straits into Achaea proper to sack their capitals. Penthesilea's faction is probably one of the more unique factions in Total War Saga Troy, as it utilizes horde mechanics from Warhammer 2. Penthesilea cannot capture settlements, only raise them, but she gets strong rewards for doing so. All her buildings, administration, and unit recruitment is integrated into her army horde. She likewise must upgrade her lowly units through initiation, but she can also call upon Bloodsworn units to temporarily control an insane amount of units regardless of her stack size. The Ajax and Diomedes DLC was released in January of 2021. This DLC offers 2 crucially important heroes to the Achaean alliance, and have been referenced countless times in the Homeric epics. Ajax the Great is a towering behemoth of a man who possesses colossal strength. His motivation is to grow his renown, prove his might to the great warriors of the world by besting them in combat. He is joined by his half-brother Tusa, an expert bowman, and as such this faction possesses some of the heaviest shielded spear units accompanied by the strongest archer units on this side of the Aegean. Pretty much a mirror of Hector's Trojan unit archetype but for the Achaean Greeks. Ajax's faction begin on the island of Salamis, and as such they have experience in maritime warfare, giving buffs to movement range at sea and providing the unique Salamis marine units. Diomedes, Athena's favourite, was renowned as the greatest tactician on the Achaean alliance. Young and dashing, Diomedes hails from Argos, leading a contingent of light and medium sword and axe infantry, specializing in fast and aggressive playstyles. He can train Paragon units, the finest of Argos, at a much faster rate than other factions and thus replenish his armies with experienced formidable units at a quick notice. His acumen for command is exemplified in his master strategist mechanic. By completing specific objectives against his enemies, he can gain dominance resource, used to garner more favorable deals on the diplomatic screen. Finally, the Mythos DLC, launched in September of 2021 alongside the Steam release of the game. To summarize from our analysis in the previous sections, Mythos adds an entirely new realism mode that embraces the exaggerations of Greek mythology. Mythical units are adapted as how the legends describe them, heroes and gods are imbued with fantastical abilities, and factions can embark on expeditions to capture one of 3 terrible monsters. Mythos is overall pretty fun, but you never feel like playing a game based on the Trojan Wars. The legends were certainly not that excessive. Hydras and griffins weren't bringing down the walls of Troy. At the same time, if they were going for a fully fledged mythological approach, then there's not enough fantasy content and diversity to keep players satisfied, yet somehow it ends up bloating the campaign even more with unnecessary mechanics like the mythical army spawning. The Greek setting is convenient for the developers to appeal to fans of Warhammer, but not nearly enough to offer anything more than a side game distraction. This game has a smaller modding scene because of its unsurprisingly smaller player base, and the Epic's Games launcher, which has a terrible interface for modding by the way, perhaps exacerbated this over the past year. We should see better and more mods on Steam. There's already loads of mods fixing many of the game's quality of life issues, but I don't think anybody will have the effort and time to fix the game's more awkward mechanics. Overall, all the DLCs are fine, but nothing exemplary. Mythos is the only one worth considering because it adds such a unique extra dimension to the game, and for that reason it's almost essential because the base game is so mediocre, yet it can only elevate Total War Saga Troy so far. I feel like this game has ultimately suffered from a lack of clear direction, with the developers unsure of what kind of Total War game they want Troy to be. It's not a great historical game, and with their ambitious attempt at a huge anniversary DLC, it ultimately is not even a great fantasy game. The tall tales of the Trojan Wars are perhaps too unwieldy to adapt properly into a Total War setting, at least for a limited saga scope and budget. Fatally, there is indecisiveness from the developers on the game's true identity. 3 out of 10. A pretty game with visual aesthetic aplenty. The campaign map is perhaps the prettiest in recent memory. However, performance and bugs let down this score. 7 out of 10. Shallow and mediocre, the campaign is an amalgamation of confusing mechanics that do not synergize well, struggles to mesh the Total War sandbox formula with the pivotal Trojan conflict at large, causing progression and pacing issues. 4 out of 10. Well-designed unit cosmetics and historical accuracy to late Bronze Age warfare is unfortunately let down by repetitive battle maps and a tactical downgrade. Double-sided experience depending on which realism mode is selected. 4 out of 10. The DLCs are decent, but in no way essential playing. Ultimately, the developers have tried to salvage the direction of the game to a more fantasy-oriented role-playing experience that will struggle to get fans hyped for any future expansion. 5 out of 10. My final rating for Total War Saga Troy is a 4.5 out of 10. The pricing is set at $49.99 US, $10 less than mainline Total War games. Its Steam debut saw a sale down to $37.50, but since then it's reverted to its base price. Pay the extra $10 and go play a better Total War game. The Amazons DLC. The uniqueness of Penthesileia's horde mechanics and the addition of cavalry make the Amazons a worthwhile playing experience. 8 out of 10. The Blood and Glory DLC absolutely required, otherwise visuals would be less indulging, but I'll never pass up the opportunity to shit on this Total War trend. 2 out of 10. Ajax and Diomedes is nice to round out the Achaean roster of heroes, but only really required if one has a certain attachment to them, otherwise it hardly brings anything new to the table. Get it on sale. 5 out of 10. The Mythos DLC is as expansive as it is expensive, but it is one of the more redeeming content passes that might be just worthwhile for some players out there, despite its issues. If you were to buy this game in the first place, then definitely try to snap this DLC with it. 7 out of 10. Even after more than a year since its release, Total War Saga Troy is a game with an identity crisis. It can't seem to make up its mind if it wants to be a fantasy or a historical Total War, and thus struggles to be either. There was a real shortage of refinement and a degree of depth that will unfortunately reduce confidence in Creative Assembly's future Saga projects. What it lacks in replayability and a strong gameplay core, it does make up for with a lot of visual charm and aesthetic flair, but a sprawling campaign map that is just too tiresome to play. This game is a stunning beauty without the personality. This was a Total War Saga Troy, a year in review. Thanks to our patrons for supporting us and making this video possible. You too can support the creation of more comprehensive analytical reviews for as little as $8 a month. Consider subscribing to us on Patreon.